Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Brad Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Brad, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to join you again.
You and I have a fun conversation today, and it's a lot different than our usual conversations. Netflix released a new movie. It's called A House of Dynamite. So I never say this in videos, but if you haven't watched the movie and you don't like spoilers, pause this video, go watch the movie, and then come back and join us for the conversation. And I want to get your take on it because you are a defense expert. So I will set the scene. I'll talk about the movie. Here's the summary. A nuclear missile is launched at the United States. It's headed directly for Chicago. And there was less than 20 minutes until it made land. And the White House in this movie doesn't know who sent the missile, and it's deciding how to respond. And the movie goes through the same around 18 minutes from a lot of different perspectives, from strategic command to the situation room, the military, and then ultimately the president. So to start off the conversation, what's real and what's fake?
I think you just summarized the movie really well, and I'm actually excited about talking about this because often I'm in kind of niche defense topics that have a niche audience, if you will. But here we have a Netflix movie that accrued more than 22 million views in the first 3 days or so, and so I was among those millions that watched it. And I'll leave the formal entertainment criticisms to others, but I really enjoyed it. But as you would expect, kind of a defense wonk like me to do, I was looking at what is fiction and what is nonfiction here, and one of the things in the movie that plays a rather prominent role that I've highlighted in direct response to your good question is so this unknown adversary launches this intercontinental ballistic missile, this ICBM, which is presumably nuclear armed. It's headed towards Chicago, only minutes to respond. And how does the United States military respond? Well, from our ground-based mid-course defense system, that's the formal name of the system, which is based in Alaska and California.
Okay, that's really good to know because when this happened, it was a really tense moment, and the defense secretary essentially was screaming at the deputy national security advisor, saying, what are the odds here? And the deputy national security advisor said, like you said, it's essentially a bullet hitting a bullet, and there's a 61% chance of this missile being intercepted. I mean, are the odds that low? Because when I heard that, I was like, that doesn't make me feel that great or safe, knowing that if a nuke, essentially, from an unknown adversary was flying towards continental USA, there's only a 61% chance of it being stopped.
Yeah, there's some this movie, if I'm being blunt, has gotten some attention in the Pentagon. It's gotten a lot of commentary. There's a lot of discussion around those numbers. Depending on one's agenda, you can find different numbers. You look at the tests. Like, tests are conducted with varying degrees of realism and versus artificiality. Hitting a bullet with a bullet is hard, but the United States of America has developed, as is Israel and others, the ability to do this. But is it 100% no? Is it 0% no? Is that number completely off? Well, I just said a moment ago we're going to fire more than one. So, right, if we thought it was 100%, we wouldn't be firing more than one. It is not 100%. It's something less than that, and we fire more than one in instances like this. But then that raises obvious questions like, well, how many do we have, and how many missiles might be fired in this? Let's remember, in this scenario, it was only one missile. There's very realistic scenarios where we could be looking at dozens or hundreds of these missiles coming inbound. So if the movie scared you, you actually should be a little bit more afraid.
Oh, great, thanks.
Yeah, you will. Yeah, that was free of charge. But yeah, anyway.
Now I want to get to the point. We have about 8 to 10 minutes till this missile makes land, and the interceptor fails. So now this missile is headed straight to Chicago, and then it went to DEFCON 1. And at the time, the admiral, who at the beginning was in the situation room, he was asked what's next, and he said there's no plan B. I mean, how true is that?
Yeah, so in the real scenario, as I've said, we would launch more than one, and there's something called shoot, look, without getting too wonky or geeky here, there's something called shoot, look, shoot. So we would, in a real world, we would know that this thing was launched shortly after it was launched. We almost certainly would know the point of origin. The scenario where we had like no clue who launched it is fairly unrealistic. I mean, there's some scenarios where there were some cyber attacks or other measures that were trying to blind our ability to see this. That's not implausible. But in a real world scenario, we would employ not only launch more than one interceptor, you'd use what's called shoot, look, shoot. And the idea there is that we would shoot the first one as early as possible in kind of that middle third of its ballistic flight so that we'd have time to shoot and then look. What are we looking? We're looking to see whether we hit it or not. So there's all kinds of debris, there's decoys, there's countermeasures, and then we assess, did we get it or not? And then we would actually have time to fire again. And so you might have several launched immediately, and then, or you might have them launched kind of in separation using the shoot, look, shoot capability. This is something that when I worked for Senator Kelly A out on New Hampshire, we'd often look at because at the time, at the unclassified level, we had a shoot, look, shoot capability for a North Korean intercontinental ballistic missile, but we didn't have it for Iran should they ever choose to field one. And that was something we were trying to push the Pentagon to develop. So there are other ways that our country has. There is some Aegis naval vessel capability to hit some kind of missiles in certain phases of flight. And of course, the big elephant in the room here is the Trump administration's Golden Dome project, the whole purpose of which is to try to give our country a better homeland missile defense. In the implication there for the whole discussion is that what we have is not sufficient. We have, a few dozen of these interceptors in Alaska and California. And we got some Aegis capability, and then we have other systems. If they're in the right spot, they could be helpful. But generally speaking, that's it. And so as your suggestions kind of imply, I think a lot of viewers are with you. That's unacceptable when we have our adversaries sprinting to field more and more capabilities to kill Americans here at home.
And I want to talk about the three central and unanswered questions that were in this movie, and we're left on some cliffhangers here. First, who fired the nuke? Second, what was its impact on Chicago? And third, what was the president's response? So let's get to the first question here. Who fired the nuke? I mean, you said it was a little unrealistic to not know which adversary fired it because it seemed like, based on the conversations we were listening to in the movie, there were three potential adversaries that could have done it: Russia, as well as China and North Korea. And I think they were leaning more towards North Korea. And I mean, the phones were off the hook talking to different, foreign officials, people like that inside the White House. I mean, how fast would you find out in real life who fired this?
Yeah, so depending on the type of missile, we would potentially know even before launch. And so depending on solid fuel, liquid fuel, there's different signatures that we would detect. There's satellite imagery. Yes, with our leading adversaries, they're developing the ability to both incapacitate and destroy our satellites. So that was kind of what I was flicking at earlier. But in the movie, it's clearly coming from the vicinity of North Korea. But it also could have been an SLBM, a submarine launched ballistic missile. So it might have been a ground-based intercontinental ballistic missile from North Korea. When they showed the maps, the movies, it was a little unclear, or it could have been a submarine launched ballistic missile. But then later on, when they're deciding how to respond, I don't want to get ahead of your questions here, but it's like, really, we're going to contemplate like starting war with China and Russia if we don't even know that they're involved? And I mean, so that's kind of another point of potential fiction, if you will.
I want to talk about that because the general in Strategic Command, I mean, he seemed a little hawkish. I mean, and that's putting it politely. I mean, you didn't even know who launched this missile, and he was like literally chomping at the bit, ready to respond. And it's like, slow your roll a little bit. We have to figure out who did this. And the deputy national security advisor was telling the president, hold back. We don't know who did this. Strategic Command saying you need to retaliate. I mean, how would you how would you advise the president to respond?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, if we're just being friendly blunt here, I mean, there's a long history of Hollywood trying to make the Pentagon look like it's almost completely led by foaming at the mouth, raving lunatics or eager for war. I'm thinking of Dr. Strangelove and here and other things. So, this is not the first Hollywood go at trying to make the Pentagon look like it's led by people like that. It's, I think a starting basically global nuclear war that might end life on Earth as we know it is probably not the right response to a missile that could have been an accidental launch or a rogue nation launch. Probably not good advice, I'd say. And so I think this time pressure that the decision makers were feeling, especially the president, was, if I'm being polite, exacerbated by very, very bad advice. But I mean, if I can, I want, the politics behind this, Director Catherine Bigelow, she said she wanted to, quote, start, quote, discussions about reducing the nuclear stockpile. So that's her agenda. She wants to reduce the nuclear stockpile. And then another screenwriter, Oppenheim, said he and Bigelow are, quote, thrilled to see a conversation happening between policymakers and experts about how to make the world a safer place. But my respectful pushback on that is, are Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping part of that conversation? Perhaps Kim Jong-un and Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran? Short answer, they're not. Because if you look at what the Defense Intelligence Agency assessed last year, here's a quote. This is a quote from the DIA. Beijing continues to outfit hundreds of ICBM silos built to support the largest nuclear expansion in Chinese history. And you mentioned the U.S. Strategic Command. This is one of the functional combatant commands that is responsible for our nation's nuclear deterrent. Well, he's portrayed in the movie. What did they say in March to Congress? They said, quote, Russia maintains the largest and most diverse nuclear arsenal in the world, including 1,550 deployed strategic nuclear warheads and up to 2,000 non-strategic nuclear warheads. And we know that Putin regularly rattles the saber. And Russia is helping North Korea, is sharing with them space, nuclear, missile applicable technology, expertise, and materials. And then lastly, of course, we saw that the U.S. and Israel degraded Iran's nuclear program, but they're refusing to let inspectors into their sites. So the point is, hey, a conversation about reducing our nuclear arsenal would be great if we had someone to have that conversation with. Unfortunately, all of our leading adversaries are going exactly the opposite direction. So if we were to do that, we simply would be engaging in some version of unilateral disarmament, making ourselves less safe. So I think the director wanted to make a case for nuclear disarmament. I think what she accidentally did was make a very persuasive case for increasing our homeland missile defense and making sure we have a strategic nuclear deterrent that is so strong that our adversaries think twice before they attack us.
I mean, to that point, it did look like the United States, based on this movie, and I know this is Hollywood and not real life, but it looks like the United States was unprepared, right? Between that 61% effective rate of if the defense system's going to work, paired with the president not really being prepared. I think he said at one point, I'm more prepared for if a Supreme Court justice crawls out of the grave and wants his seat back than this. So yeah. I mean, so it doesn't, yeah. Is the United States more prepared than what this movie perhaps projects?
Yes, absolutely. The United States, and I'm not saying, no one told me to say this. I'm not reading off some marketing brochure. Someone who's done this for several years now. I will tell you with confidence, because obviously I'm concerned about the well-being of my family and our country, is we have a safe and effective nuclear deterrent. We have a current homeland missile defense capability that is useful for a small attack against our country. So, 5, 10, 15-ish ballistic missiles headed toward the United States, I'm fairly confident that we would be okay. When you start to get to the higher end of that range, I just said I'd get a little bit more nervous. But when you consider the numbers I just gave you about the numbers of missiles our adversaries have, obviously, we do not have the ability to defend ourselves against a full-scale attack from China or Russia. And that's not new. That's been around going back to the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and that's where you had the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. We can destroy your country, you can destroy ours, so therefore don't try it. So we're literally relying on the other person to be sane and rational and not want to commit suicide. And that's why, until we get the point to actually have a kind of a Reagan-esque strategic deterrence initiative or Star Wars where we can shoot down everything, which is not going to happen in our lifetimes, you got to have that nuclear deterrent to persuade Beijing and Moscow that it would be suicide for them to do it. So it feels good in Hollywood to say that, but it would actually make us less safe and increase the chances you would actually experience the things the movie was portraying.
I know that in this conversation we're talking about nuclear weapons and missiles being launched into the United States and how to respond, and that's what the crux of this movie is about. But I do want to go on a side tangent, if you will, because I saw perhaps a potential comparison to 9/11. When President Bush found out about 9/11, he was sitting in front of a classroom reading a book to kids. One of his staffers came over, whispered in his ear what exactly happened, and President Bush remained very calm. He didn't get up right away. He stayed there, then eventually got up and then made his move. And that moment has really been dissected in the past 20 years. This was very different because the president in this movie, he was with kids, he was playing basketball with a group of kids, and he found out by essentially he got yanked out. It was very dramatic how they yanked him out. They didn't tell him exactly what was happening until they threw him in the car. And as the car was going high speed, it seemed, he was told that America's under attack. I mean, what did you make of that? What's the better response? What happened in real life where it was more calm and measured, or this really chaotic yanking out the president?
No, it's so interesting and relevant that you mentioned 9/11. Yeah, I mean, if you can your viewers can go back and watch that video where I believe it was this chief of staff, Andy Card, if I didn't get that wrong, who walked in and whisper. You can see him whispering in the president's ear, and they, and I think didn't he pick up his book and keep reading? But of course, we had the vice president that just passed away in the last few days. In my understanding, it was the vice president was the one who got yanked down into the situation room, was making some of those decisions until President Bush at the time could get in a position where he could get briefed, fully updated, and start to make some of those decisions. So if you consider the timeline for what an actual attack would look like, that's not unrealistic, where you'll have someone giving a speech somewhere, or engaging with the American public, and all of a sudden this bad news comes in. And that's why you do have an individual who travels with the president, with the nuclear football, we colloquially call it, that has those codes and has those plans. And it's also why I would say you want leaders, not just the president, but key leaders up and down the chain of command, who are serious, thoughtful people who can make life and death decision in a matter of minutes. Because, I mean, given the obvious stakes. And so I actually was a commander of Charlie Company 12th Aviation Battalion on the night of 9/11 in the DC area, and was involved in getting our nation's leaders out of DC to hide sites on September 11, 2001, and was actually flying on the night of 9/11. Took the Deputy Secretary of Defense from one of those hide sites to the Pentagon. And the helipad we normally would land on once, twice, three times a week, was destroyed because it was at the point of impact at the Pentagon there. And so that wasn't a nuclear attack on our country, but it was like kind of having a front row seat for me, if you will, about seeing our nation's leaders dealing with a surprise attack, the stress involved with that, and the need to make important decisions. And of course, on that night, we were making decisions about, do we shoot down a civilian airliner to save our nation's capital, for example. So you want people in those kind of positions who are prepared to make life and death decisions.
And to that point, I mean, life or death decision, and you only have minutes to make it. And you see the president really going back and forth with, what should I do? They didn't know the adversary at the time. But let's say this is a real life situation. Let's take Hollywood out of it for a moment. Let's say, like you said, we probably do know the adversary. Let's say we know the adversary. And they have only a few minutes before this is 100% hitting land in Chicago. I mean, would you want the president to immediately retaliate as that missile's in the air? I mean, what realistically does the response look like?
Yeah, I mean, you want to know who did it. I think what I'm suggesting to you, I mean, you could have a catastrophic scenario where we're completely blinded and we're completely surprised. I'm not saying that's impossible, but you would want to know who did it. You'd want to know whether it's deliberate or accidental. I mean, if it's accidental, then starting nuclear war would be suboptimal, right? And they explored this in the movie, right? Is this just a one-off? Is someone just they launch it thinking, hey, Americans will shoot it down. We look tough. They shoot it down. No harm, no foul. We're all good. Is it that, or is it the first phase of what could be a comprehensive large-scale attack where you're going to have dozens or hundreds of missiles right behind it, and what we do or don't do will affect that decision making. Lots of questions, and those questions were explored in the movie. But I think what we can be confident of is what has been called the fog of war. That you have leaders, and in this case the president, having to make decisions with imperfect or even inaccurate information. But you're asking me what I would say if I were in that moment. I would not have advised the president do a wholesale, large scale attack when we didn't even know who did it, and we don't know. You do everything possible. Launching one GBI was ridiculously foolish and stupid and not realistic. We almost certainly would have got that one shot down, but let's say that we didn't. How do you make things better by starting a nuclear war? If the worst case scenario is correct and you're about to see dozens or hundreds of missiles launching, well, you'll still have time to launch your attack, right? The whole purpose of a kind of this aggressive forward leading, let's launch our missiles while we can, that's a Soviet Union Cold War mentality where we think all of our silos are about to get hit and we'll literally lose the ability to counterpunch. So after you've exhausted all means to shoot down the missile, there really is no advantage in not waiting 10 or 15 minutes, because you're in no danger of losing your ability to counterpunch unless there's some impending cyber attack or something like that. So I think that's a key consideration and would have informed what I would have been advising in that moment.
And something I was curious about too, there was obviously human elements to this movie. You see the defense secretary say, "Hey, my daughter lives in Chicago." And he calls his daughter. He doesn't mention that, "Hey, there's a nuke headed your way in 8 minutes or less." I mean, realistically, what happens when it's DEFCON 1, there's a nuclear weapon, there's a nuclear missile headed towards some part of the United States? I mean, would people be aware of this? How would the government, from the president down, get this message out to the American people in time? Or is it there is no time because, it's going to be so catastrophic that you can't really run or hide? You don't have the time.
Yeah, no, my experience is kind of focusing on the Pentagon angle, the military angle to this. So I have less visibility on the Homeland Security angle and that you're referring to, which was in part portrayed in the movie, which I find very interesting. But if we just think through it practically, if you're talking about 15 or 20 minutes, right? And you're talking about the city of Chicago, right? I mean, what are you going to be able to do in 15 or 20 minutes? People could get to their basements. I mean, Israel, we can learn something from Israel on this, right? In the 12-day war with Iran, and how there were so relatively, every life is precious, but there were so relatively few casualties because of the bunker, the bunkers that they have, the safe rooms and that sort of thing, and the early warning system. But they portray how the Secretary of Defense is, calling his daughter, and it makes for, it was very emotional, right? You can imagine how, like, if that someone in your family is going to be in this attack, that one of your first thoughts or your first thought would be taking care of them. But of course, you would expect if this were a real attack that our enemies would be monitoring the communications of our senior leaders. And if you're literally calling on an unsecure phone number, then you would be potentially betraying valuable information that our adversaries could use against us. And any serious person in such a job would know that, but that would have to be balanced against their love and concern for their family members. And I mentioned 9/11 when, after the first tower was hit, we were flying back to our base in a Black Hawk helicopter, and I took the time to call my wife on that day. And I said, and at that point, it sounds kind of like scaredy cat now to say it, but we didn't know what was going to happen next. So I was telling my wife to stay in the house, stay in the house, stay in the house. And I was able to do that, I felt, and still do my duty and accomplish the mission. But you could understand that pull in that moment for key leaders. But I do think in the movie, as portrayed, the Secretary of Defense was being a little bit negligent, if I do say so.
I don't think that's scaredy cat at all. I think anyone with a pulse and a family member would call them in that moment. But when you're looking at this movie, and obviously, it's pretty scary. It's talking about nuclear weapons. It's talking about, people stepping back from what happened post-Cold War, and there's more nukes. How close do you think we've ever been to something like this happening?
Oh, good question. As a student of history, I'd say the Cuban Missile Crisis was probably on the top 2 or 3 list. Students of history will be familiar with that, where the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba, and we had the blockade. And in that case, you did have President Kennedy getting some, with the benefit of hindsight, some bad advice from the military. So the military doesn't always get it right and doesn't have a monopoly on wisdom. I'm not here saying that at all. But that was a pretty touch and go moment. And this is one reason why, some people might listen to the first half of what I said, oh, this guy just wants the bigger the better. No, I don't. I really would love to have a strategic nuclear agreements that involved the United States, Russia, and China that provided increased transparency, reduces risk, and if possible, in a verifiable, trust but verify way, lowers the number of arsenals. I would love that. But, as they say, it takes 2 or in this case 3 to tango. And we don't have that right now, as the testimony demonstrates, which I just said. And so China is resisted for years any effort to negotiate in good faith. And of course, Russia is, if they're anything, they blow off their agreements and cannot be trusted. And of course, Putin's rattling his nuclear saber and expanding and modernizing their nuclear arsenal. And engage in the worst war in Europe since World War II. So we don't have anyone on the other side of the negotiating table right now. So that pushes me back to modernize our nuclear triad. I'm referring to the Sentinel intercontinental ballistic missile, which is overdue. The one that we have is older and needs to be replaced. the fielding of the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, and also the fielding of the new B-21 Raider strategic bomber. And each one of those legs of the triad offers something different that creates dilemmas for our adversaries that are so difficult for them to solve that they say, hey, it's too hard, we're not going to try. And that keeps Americans safe for yet another day, another week, another year.
And my last question to you is, someone asked this in the Situation Room about Pyongyang. They said, saber rattling or silence, I don't know what scares me more. But I think that can apply to all of our adversaries. What scares you more as the defense expert? Is it when our adversaries are saber rattling or when they go silent?
That's a great question. It's a thoughtful question. I think it would depend on the adversary, because each of our adversaries brings different amounts of power, different size hammer, if you will, and kind of different cultural approaches. And so you could have silence in one case, which means one thing, and in a different cultural context means a completely a different one. But I think often in the United States, our biggest mistake is we don't listen to what our adversaries are actually saying. And if you look at what China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are saying, and more importantly, what they're doing as this axis of aggressors, they're engaging in levels of cooperation, both economic, technological, cyber, and military cooperation. Military cooperation, weapons development, weapons proliferation, intelligence sharing, military exercise, mill-to-mill coordination in ways that we have not seen in decades. And it's making each of them more capable individually and more capable together. And we have assumptions, frankly, that need to be updated, where we kind of pretend like it's 1991 when America is like kind of the dominant, went into a decade of to be kind of the dominant unipolar power. Those days are long gone. And I think a lot of Americans think that the balance of power between us and China is more favorable to us than it really is. And I would just end with this. The movie was scary enough. I don't want to scare anyone, but I think good policy starts with an objective assessment of reality. There was a bipartisan congressionally mandated National Defense Strategy Commission the summer before last, and your viewers can look it up and Google it. They say, I'm paraphrasing, they say something like the following: this is the most dangerous geostrategic moment Americans have confronted since 1945. There's a possibility for near-term major war for which we are unprepared. Yeah. Okay. So sorry, I don't mean to add. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that? Well, step one would be, let's actually have a peace through strength policy. And it's hard to have a peace through strength policy if you request a defense budget that doesn't even keep up with inflation. So we don't want what happened in that movie ever to happen. And if it does, you want to have really good missile defenses that actually work and shoot it down. And if it's, instead of it being just like one accidental missile or some crazy person wants you, and it's dozens or hundreds, then you want them to think twice before they do that. And the only thing that will make them think twice is if they know we have the ability to do that to them too. That's the sad state of human affairs and history, but that's my read, and that's what I recommend.
Well, this was definitely a divergence from what we usually talk to, but a really fun conversation. Also a bit alarming of a conversation. I feel like I need to take a deep breath and, but it's a very, very important conversation, and I hope we can have more of them. I actually hope more political thrillers crop up on Netflix and wherever people watch their movies, so you and I can break them down and talk about how realistic they are, because this was so much fun. Brad Bowman, thank you so much for coming on. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much.